Colleagues, thank you for joining us this afternoon in our seminar in partnership with a number of stakeholders, including the George Washington University, International and Comparative Law, International Budget Partnership, Asivikelane Budget Partnership, and the College of Law, UNISA, as well as the Department of Public Constitutional International Law at UNISA. This is part of the Global South, Global North partnerships that we are trying to explore, all in the pursuit of advancing knowledge, all in the pursuit of generating Africa-centric knowledge about African issues from scholars who study the goings on in Africa at a very advanced level. So we are here today with our very own Dr. Alison Anthony, who is currently in the US, because UNISA allowed her to go there and shine the UNISA flag high, and she's doing exactly that. Thank you, Dr. Alison, for that. And we are also here with Tracy Just. She's one of our speakers today, and Dean Rosa Celerio is also with us, and Ms. Nonhlanhla Matibela is also with us today. These are our guest speakers for the day. And we know that in our midst, we have other officials from other institutions, such as government offices, as well as international organizations that play a hand in the discussion that we have today. Mine is not to, drag the talk too much, but to allow the head of department, through his representative, Dr. Dennis Metuche, to address us. Dr. Metuche, over to you.
Thank you, Angelo. Thank you all. It's really an honor for me to welcome all here with us today on behalf of the College of Law, and particularly the Department of Public, Constitutional, and International Law. I'm sure Professor Shai would have loved to be here himself, but unfortunately he wasn't able to join us. But I echo him when I say it is indeed a privilege for us to welcome our distinguished attendees from the Department of State, distinguished speakers, and other attendees on this seminar on advancing women's rights through public infrastructure procurement. Indeed, women have always been associated with life, which is probably why we hear things or people say, Mama Africa, Mother Earth, amongst other things. So I do believe that if we truly want to see more life and prosperity in our environments, more consideration must be awarded to the advancement of women's rights, not the least through very much consideration in public infrastructure procurement practices. So at this stage, it's truly an honor to be with you. I'm going to hand it over to Angelo, who is going to help us with the rollout of the rest of the seminar. I really wish you all enjoy it. I know I will, and I look forward to interactions. Thank you, Angelo.
Thank you, Dr. Metuche, for that brief word of welcome. If we could all stick to such brevity in our talk, in fact, we would save a lot on time and produce more on research. And then Africa would go ahead, Africa would become great again. Thank you for that. I will call upon Ms. Matibela to take the podium and introduce, to us, our speakers. But before doing so, she will briefly tell us what this seminar is about, so that we're all on the same page on what's happening here today. Mr. Matibela, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Angelo, and good day to all. So, as Angelo mentioned earlier, we are meeting on the last day of Women's Month as we celebrate Women's Month across the world. And we've seen the need to recognize the advancement of women's rights internationally. This is because women continue to face various forms of discrimination, and this is on various platforms such as the gender pay gap, physical abuse, harassment, and also poverty through reduced payments for domestic work. So today we will grapple this global phenomenon by looking at how gender inclusive can contribute to the improvement of sanitation across our informal settlements, and we're specifically going to zoom into the South African context. Most importantly, this platform creates an exciting opportunity to bring together the invaluable experiences of our academics and practitioners. And I think this is such an exciting opportunity because it is very rare to find a good equilibrium where both partners meet and try and grapple situations that affect our most common residents at a lower level. So I'm really honored to introduce our esteemed panelists, starting with Dean Rosa Celerio. She is from the Burnett Family Associate Dean, and she's a distinguished professional lecturer in international and comparative law and policy at George Washington University. In this capacity, she directs the International and Comparative Law program at GW Law School. She teaches courses which include International Human Rights of Women, Regional Protection of Human Rights, and Fundamental Issues in US Law. The second member of our panelist is Ms. Tracy Euster. She's the head of special programs at the International Budget Partnership South Africa, where she supports grassroots organizations to advocate for dignified access to water, sanitation, and healthcare in informal settlements. Her work promotes transparency and accountability in government budget processes. Last but not least, we have Dr. Alison Anthony from the Department of Public, Constitutional, and International Law. Dr. Anthony specializes in public procurement law research, and she's the Deputy Director of the Afrikan Procurement Law Unit. As you can hear, ladies and gentlemen, we have such an esteemed panelist and list of panels. I'm very, very excited to see how the rest of the webinar is going to pan out. Please join me in welcoming them, and we shall proceed to Dean Rosa.
Well, first of all, good morning and good afternoon. It's absolutely wonderful to be here with all of you. And it's my great honor to be here, especially on a month that's so important as Women's Rights Month and in South Africa. And for me, it's always wonderful to be able to discuss women's rights issues, but particularly today to connect to public infrastructure procurement, which I think is a priority issue, especially when it comes to government action and activities when it comes to furthering women's rights. I want to thank all of the organizers. Thank you so much, Alison Anthony, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful event, and also the University of South Africa College of Law. It's really an honor to be here participating in this event, especially on Women's Month, which is a very significant month in South Africa. And I just wanted to say how much of a joy it is for me to always discuss women's rights issues. But in this particular instance, it's truly a privilege to be able to connect them to public infrastructure procurement. And one thing that I wanted to say to start with is that when we think of women's rights today, we have a body of global and regional standards that have been already set and recognized by governments around the world related to the human rights of women, adopted at both the global and national levels. I also wanted to highlight that when you look at that body of standards, they not only address key issues in the realm of women's rights that were already mentioned, like discrimination and violence against women, but they have also advocated for this gender perspective or this gender inclusive perspective in all state actions and interventions, especially from governments, anything that comes from the government. And usually what we mean by this gender perspective is this understanding, that women have been historically discriminated against, that they have historically suffered gender-based violence, and they still do, that women have been at a disadvantage, when it comes to reaping the benefits of societies. And what I mean by these benefits are not only the economic, but also the civil and political benefits of societies, right? And what's very important to keep in mind when you think of this gender perspective is that it applies to government services, the contracts, and the area of public infrastructure procurement. This is within the coverage of the global standards that governments have recognized when it comes to women's rights issues, which entail obligations on the part of the governments. South Africa has ratified a number of these treaties as well. So it's very important to keep them in mind, in the provision and in the organization and in the logistics and the features of public infrastructure procurement. And I think these are also critical and can be very helpful to inform public infrastructure procurement, government services, and business activities in this area. This is what we call this gender inclusive perspective, or this gender inclusive approach. I just wanted to say a few words about what women and human rights are in the present, especially when you think of international law, especially when you think of global and regional standards, and how this connects to public infrastructure procurement at the national level. Right now, when you think of women's rights, we're talking not only about this very vast international law framework that has a number of cornerstone global and regional treaties, including the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which we call CEDAW, but also the Maputo Protocol that was adopted in Africa that really advances the rights of women. And also we have the views and case judgments from United Nations treaty-based organs and also regional commissions and courts, but we also have a recognition of women's rights issues at the national level. So this is not purely a global issue, it's also a national issue. This is actually protected by constitutions around the world, by legislation around the world, by national policies, and also case judgments from high courts and lower courts in different countries in the world. We also have a body of instruments that's very important to keep in mind. When we're thinking of women's rights, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that really is reflected in most of the human rights treaties that we have today, but also in constitutions around the world. We also have the United Nations Charter. We have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We also have an International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We have CEDAW, that convention to eliminate discrimination against women. And we also have the Convention on the Rights of the Child and other treaties that are very applicable, or at least enumerate what obligations governments have, or treaties that have given the opportunity for governments to assume specific obligations to advance the rights of women. And South Africa is a party to most of these instruments and treaties. In terms of what we call basic rights when it comes to women's rights, we have a range of civil and political rights that are very well recognized at this particular stage. We have the rights to life, to non-discrimination and equality, to freedom from violence, abuse, and harassment, participation, personal liberty, freedom of expression and access to information, and access to justice. As you will see, this is a combination of substance rights, but also facilitating rights, rights that are very important to be able to enforce rights, especially when you go into the area of freedom of expression and access to information and access to justice in particular. And then we have a range of economic, social, and cultural rights. And these are very important rights because they're not only very important for individuals, but also they're systemic rights, right? If they're not working, if the systems are not working, women are failing, women are at a disadvantage, right? So we have the right to health, the right to work, the right to social security, the right to education, the right to housing, the right to food, the right to water. And of course, sanitation considerations are very connected to all these rights in some way or the other. And also, I think when we think of economic, social, and cultural rights, I think it's very important to highlight that we have a range of obligations when it comes to sanitation concerns, but also those basic health food and water and basic subsistence rights in many ways in international law at this stage. You know, we have the principle of progressive realizations that states are supposed to use the maximum available resources to advance these rights and to create systems to be able to have these rights implemented in reality. But we also have a range of obligations of an immediate nature. We have an obligation for governments to satisfy a minimum core of these rights, right? You know, and by a minimum core is sufficient levels for persons to be able to survive on the basis of these rights. And this is particularly key when we're thinking of sanitation and food and water and health and basic needs. We also have this right to non-discrimination that it's always of immediate effect, no matter in which treaty it has been included. We also have an obligation for states to take immediate steps to actually enforce these rights. And we also have the principle of non-regression, that states are not supposed to regress in the protection of these rights at the ground level. And also we have a whole range of instruments and rights that are protected that are related to the activity of businesses and human rights. Even though businesses are not government entities, the reality is that they do have specific responsibilities when it comes to human rights issues. And two of them that are very, very key are do no harm, right? Do not commit or perpetuate or support the commission of human rights violations, but also provide that access to remedies as well. And businesses also have responsibilities when it comes to the treatment of their employees, you know, the way they administer pay, the way they administer their own services and protections for employees. And also employees have a right to be in workplaces free from all forms of discrimination and violence and harassment as well. So when you think of women's rights today and what women's rights are at the global and regional and national levels, there is a broad range of challenges that we start with, right? You know, we have issues related to access to basic services. Most women around the world do not have an equal access or a sufficient access or an adequate access to basic services. And when it comes to access, we're talking about affordability issues, accessibility issues, quality issues, and there's a broad range of services that enter, right, this rubric. We're talking about food and water and sanitation and health and employment and others. We have a huge and dire problem of violence against women. We're still talking about 1 in 3. This is the figure of the World Health Organization. 1 in 3 women will experience violence in their lifetime. We have a huge problem of discrimination and stereotypes of women's roles and what women should be doing or not doing in a specific society. We have severe limitations in the participation of women in all aspects of public life. And this is not only related to political participation, but also public participation. And as we will be discussed, participation in public procurement processes is a challenge as well. We also have these very, very thorny impediments to the exercise of civil and political rights. We also have a huge problem of poverty. We always say in the women's rights field that poverty has the face of women, meaning women are still affected by what we call the feminization of poverty and have issues when it comes to economic autonomy as well. There's still a lot of limitations to access decent and quality employment opportunities and for women to rise to decision-making positions within the employment sphere. And we have a lot of issues related to, of course, health and sexual and reproductive rights. And of course, the environment is a major actor when it comes to women's rights today. It's very difficult to talk about the environment and the challenges that we have with climate change and the triple planetary crisis without thinking about how these challenges affect women as well today. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what this all means for women and public infrastructure procurement. And a lot of what we're seeing in public infrastructure procurement is a distance, right? A gap between all these well-recognized standards, you know, that should apply, right, to government services and government administration, you know, basically a distance and a gap between these legal standards and what the practice is, right? In general, we have an absence of a gender perspective in procurement and infrastructure efforts. We have very little participation from women in infrastructure procurement activity in general, especially from women-led businesses right? We also have barriers and a lot of limitations and obstacles to access basic services, such as water and sanitation and health and food. You even have absence of lighting in dangerous locations and in public locations. And these all become impediments for women's participation and education, and even for women to reap the benefits of economic development in their societies. We also have an issue of information, and this is a very, very important issue that affects most countries. You know, you have women-led businesses, you have women entrepreneurs, but they don't necessarily have timely information or the training necessary, or they have to confront this very large bureaucracies to be able to know and take advantage of procurement opportunities and procedure. Bureaucracy is really a huge issue that has an impact on the implementation of women's rights in this area. Right. And also we have contract award processes that tend to be very biased, and there's fairness issues. We have a lot of male dominated processes and the absence of many women that could be participating in these processes. And stereotypes are a huge issue still for women's rights issues. You know, women still face great expectations, and I would say also an assignment of roles or assumptions of what they can do or not do, right? And this affects not only women interpreters, but also women-led businesses. And they also impact women's role as suppliers and stakeholders. They have less time to submit bids and monitor procurement processes. Women are frequently affected by something that we call the gender division of labor in the home. Usually they have more family responsibilities. Usually they have more responsibilities in the home. And this affects also their time, right, to submit bids and monitor procurement processes. We also have a gender digital gap. I mean, the reality is that right now, especially in a world, we're living in a post-pandemic world, right? Or at least we're still in the COVID pandemic, where we're maybe entering an endemic phase, right? And usually one thing, you know, that has been the most documented as a legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic is that we have really moved on to a more digital world, right? So access to technology is extremely important in the world today. A lot of activity is turning or transitioning into being digital, but women are lagging behind in the access of not only the technology necessary, but also the gender digital skills necessary. Right. And I also want to talk a little bit about that absence of an intersectional perspective as well. In public infrastructure procurement, usually when we talk about discrimination and when we talk about women, we don't talk about women anymore as just a homogeneous group. We talk about women as women with different experiences, with different races and ethnicities and social classes and linguistic backgrounds and ages and disabilities and other kinds of factors and conditions that have historically discriminated or operated against women and placed them at a disadvantage. The reality is that when we look at public infrastructure procurement today, we don't necessarily have a reflection of that intersectional experience, right? Or features within these processes that could actually open opportunities for women actually that have lived through those intersectional experiences. Like, for example, women of African descent, indigenous women, women with disabilities, young women, for example, women affected by conflicts, women that have been displaced, for example, women that face specific health situations and other factors as well. I also wanted to say that we have a lot of challenges also when it comes to businesses, right? You know, in the area of public infrastructure procurement, right? We have a lot of discriminatory attitudes and forms of violence and harassment that still affect women in businesses and employers in general. We have remembered that gender division of labor, that women tend to be concentrated in sectors that are valued less. And we have the issue of unpaid domestic work, that a lot of the work that women do is not rewarded or valued socially. We have a huge gender pay gap issue. Women are still not paid in the same way as men. And this is a very important issue that crosses in the North and the South. This is not just a problem in countries in the South. It's also a problem in countries of the North. And also women in general have more limited opportunities to generate income through business ownership and entrepreneurship as well. right? So I also want to discuss, though, not only limitations, but I do think this is an area when you think of public infrastructure procurement, when you think of gender equality issues or that need for gender inclusion, right? And public infrastructure procurement, I think there's very important opportunities here for governments. For example, when you have and you open spaces for women to participate in public procurement processes, this means more inclusion and empowerment and leadership of women, especially of women-led businesses and women entrepreneurs. This is a very important component and should be a very important component of any strategy related to public infrastructure procurement. It's also important to include women's participation in the design of public services in general. I mean, this leads to innovation, this leads to creativity, this leads to more diversity. It better addresses the needs of women in general, and it's better for society as a whole. There's also an opportunity to develop more policies and strategies to advance what we call this gender responsive procurement, including this intersectional perspective. And it's very important to do training, right? When governments are actually designing strategies to increase women's participation or make processes that could be more responsive to women, it's very important to also train procurement officials as well. Also, the publication of information is huge in the area of public infrastructure procurement about planning, tender, awards, contracts, and the implementation of public contracts. I think transparency is a very important word, when we're talking about public infrastructure procurement. Also, there's been experiences in other countries that have been successful in the transition to public online procurement portals. I mean, the transition to a digital phase, when it comes to procurement can actually be very advantageous, and we have examples from Chile and the Dominican Republic, for example, and it's something that will continue happening, and it's an incredible opportunity. I was just speaking additionally about those opportunities for governments that I do think the need to simplify those applications is very important, to streamline and standardize tender documentation of qualification procedures, the need to reduce bureaucracy. I think governments also can be leaders here, right? In this area, they can build support networks and can be key conveners. They can convene banks and financial institutions, business development service providers, non-government organizations, business networks, professional associations, and corporations. They can also provide capacity building to women businesses in procurement processes and how to avail themselves of procurement processes or how to participate in these procurement processes. And I think accountability and incentives are really key, especially if you're trying to motivate that women participate more in these processes. And also there are better business and labor practices as well. And I just wanted to conclude by saying that gender responsive public procurement is not only a human rights issue or a women's rights issue. It's not only an obligations issue when it comes to global and regional treaties and national mandates, but there's also benefits, social benefits to gender responsive public procurement. It has been documented that it increases the productive capacity of economies. It promotes economic growth. It increases employment opportunities as well. It also incentivizes this fair allocation of economic resources and an improvement of living standards for all. It also contributes to advancing Goal 5 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals on gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. And lastly, it contributes to addressing many of the major women's rights issues of our time. It contributes to closing that gender pay gap, to reducing discrimination, to reducing violence, and also it can have a positive influence on employment practices as well. And I want to say that one of the advantages of convening this type of event is that we have great experts in this area. We have Allison Anthony that's doing an amazing line of research in this area. We have Tracy Jost that's actually leading an organization that's doing a lot of this kind of work. So there's a lot of resources and expertise in this area that I think can be really very helpful for governments and businesses as well in this area. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Rosa. That was a very good presentation. You touched on some of the most compelling aspects of this topic that we have here today. It was a very riveting presentation. I thought I knew a little bit about public procurement, but the way you were interweaving it with a bit of human rights here and there, a bit of standards and norms set by the UN here and there, I learned a lot from that as well. Ladies and gentlemen, with a show of hands, I will be monitoring the hand signals on the platform here. Soper Williams, you're number 1. I'm trying to look for other hands so I can give the order in which those hands will come. Only your hand is up for now. So because there's no second hand coming up, I'll give you the platform.
Hi, colleagues. Thank you, Rosa. Thank you, everyone. So, Rosa, I have a question for you. I did some research on gender-inclusive procurement with Alison, 2021, and wrote a report on gender-inclusive procurement in South Africa. And we did a number of interviews. And one of the things that I think I found out that was most surprising for me was that many procurement officials don't see the importance of gender responsive procurement. So they don't see it as even an issue that needs to be addressed. You know, it's one thing to say, okay, we do have a problem, but it's another thing to say we actually don't have a problem. So I wanted to ask, like, what do you feel is like the way to get around that beyond, beyond kind of obviously, you know, social and cultural education and people just, you know, thinking that women are important, right? What do you think that we can do specifically, like, that will bring us, that will create that awareness of why this is an important issue that we don't currently have?
Well, thank you. Thank you. This is a wonderful question. I just wanted to say that it's very important to institutionalize this, right? So, for example, laws and policies are extremely important in this area, right? You know, to make sure that this is mandatory, right? That this is not necessarily just optional, right? And this has been very important of most gender inclusive strategies or gender mainstreaming strategies, you know, and most issues related to the government in general. It's a very common problem that government officials just don't think it's very important. That's why we have laws and policies and protocols, right? You know, and basically guidelines and mandatory mandates, right? You know, for a lot of these gender inclusive strategies, but also you need accountability mechanisms as well. You know, I think accountability mechanisms are extremely important, you know, and you set benchmarks in those accountability mechanisms. Employees that don't follow, you know, those benchmarks, you know, there's different kinds of results, you know, or they have to face specific responsibility for not following those benchmarks. But I think incentives are also extremely important as well. I mean, you do need, you know, a multi-focus strategy, right, to be able to work with government officials. I think you need those laws and policies, you need training, you need accountability mechanisms, right? And you also need incentives as well, right? But definitely you want to make sure that this is mandatory, right? Because at the end of the day, if it's just optional, then it's very difficult to get officials to be able to actually advance these issues. And training is also key. I mean, I do so much training of government officials and even the judiciary. And sometimes there's lack of knowledge as well, lack of understanding as well, right? You know, so training is also a very important part of the strategy as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim Rosa. Prof, here your hand is up. You'll be next. But before you speak, can I see if there's any other hand? I'm taking the last round. If there's any other hand, please do raise it now. Otherwise, this will be the last hand, and we'll release Din Rosa to continue with her class. So going once, going twice, closed. Over to you, Prof. here.
Thank you very much. Dean Rosa, thank you for your input. So picking up just on the question that my colleague has just asked, and also in your answer, I'm very interested in your thoughts on the structural aspects of moving this agenda, because it seems to me that as long as we conceptualize public procurement as purely or at least primarily an issue of public finance, and thus structurally situating it within a financial paradigm, this will always remain a marginal issue, and it will be an uphill battle to justify the kind of very, usual cost arguments that there's a price to be paid and value for money and, the usual thing. So I'm wondering whether, or what your thoughts are on how can we really shift that debate. And let me just be very clear, in South Africa, we are going through this process now. We've got a window of opportunity of reforming our entire procurement system. And I think it's thus very important for us to get insights on, at a structural level, what would be ideal if we are serious about taking this agenda forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I echo what you just said. At the end of the day, if you only treat it as a public finance issue or a cost issue, it's definitely complicated. I think, especially when you're thinking of gender inclusion, it's very important to treat this kind of issue as a government issue in general, right? It's not just a public finance issue, it's a government services issue, it's also a government opportunities issue, right? And I think it's also very important to work with the actors that are involved in public procurement as well. I think it's very important, for governments to also be conveners here, to also work with businesses in general, with the different actors, that render the services as well, And I think at the end of the day, part of the problem that we have in this issue is that we need to do more research of why this is advantageous, right? The reality is that, when you have gender inclusive public procurement, you have more economic growth, you have more productive economies, right? But this needs to be better documented as well. And usually when you have that kind of documentation, a lot of the arguments related to cost, a lot of the arguments related to public finance, usually it's easier to address them. It's kind of similar to the conversation that we've had for a really long time about gender budgets, right? Why do we need budgets at the government level to address gender issues, right? And now there's more documentation showing that having gender budgets is advantageous for society in general. It's actually more cost effective for society in general. And I think we need to do more research in that area as well so that we can have more data. I think part of the challenge that we have in this area is that we don't necessarily have the data, but it's so amazing to see all the research that's happening in South Africa. And South Africa is a country that has been a leader in many things. And I think it can be a leader in this area as well. And it has wonderful research happening in this area as well. So I'm very hopeful. And I'm so happy that this kind of events are happening. I think that you have a tremendous opportunity in South Africa for this to become, a country that can actually open opportunities, and a country that's studied by other countries in the world when it comes to inclusive public procurement and, on public procurement in general as well.
Thank you, Dean Rosa. That was an interesting response and an enlightening talk on the issues that you raised. I will not hold you back any further. I will take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of the University of South Africa, the College of Law, and the Department of Public, Constitutional and International Law, and on behalf of our colleague, Dr. Alison Anthony, who connected us with you. We appreciate your efforts, appreciate you being here today. I will now release you to go and attend to your students. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me again, and I hope you have a wonderful event. It's a great event and a very important topic.
Thanks, Rosa.
Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we will move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the topic promoting women's rights in infrastructure provision, sanitation, and informal settlements, presented to us by Ms. Tracy Just, who is the special head of special programs, International Budget Partnership South Africa. Over to you.
Thanks so much. Thank you for the introduction. We just move some things around. Are you all able to see my presentation?
Yes, we can
It's
see.
visible on my side, yes.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, thanks everyone for making time to be part of this important conversation today. And special thanks to Rosa for giving such a useful and fantastic global overview on some of these perspectives. And a lot of these issues relate very strongly to the South African context, which will be the focus of my presentation today. So I'm going to speak specifically about the work that IBP South Africa and its partners are doing in informal settlements in South Africa through a campaign called Asibekelane, and link work to issues of sanitation, procurement, and how this affects women's health and well-being and safety in particular. Just to start with a bit of context for those who may not be too familiar with South Africa, a significant proportion of people living in South African cities live in informal settlements. Nationally, it's estimated at around 10 million people. We have 8 major cities. In most of those cities, easily 20-25% of the population are living in informal settlements. These are sometimes referred to as slums in other countries. And these communities and the settlements themselves are really characterized by very precarious conditions. The form of shelter that people have is not adequate. It's often shacks made with corrugated iron or wood or other materials, often very overcrowded, with very limited and sometimes no access to communal water and sanitation. Now, these services, these basic services, water, sanitation, electricity, and solid waste, are the responsibility of local governments to provide to informal settlements. And there are minimum standards for this. By way of example, the minimum standard for water access is that one tap should serve no more than 25 households. One toilet should serve no more than 5 households to manage the level of access. But more often than not, dozens of households are sharing a single toilet, and it's not uncommon to have 40, 50 households sharing a single tap. So extremely limited access to services across informal settlements, and just very unsafe conditions. Many of these communities have extremely poor resilience to natural disasters. We saw that recently in KZN with the floods. And so the extent of informality in South Africa is widely known. And we do have a comprehensive suite of policies which have been in place since 1994 to address the lack of housing access, the lack of services. But these policies at a national scale have not really led to wide-scale change. And for this reason, the challenges in informal settlements does remain high on the agenda. And this is really the focus of the advocacy that we do through the Asifikelane campaign, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. So Asifikelane means let's protect each other in Zulu. And this initiative really is about informal residents themselves advocating for basic services. The methodology underpinning the campaign is that once a month, working with our grassroots partners who work across the metros and within informal settlements, they collect data from communities about the experiences with water, sanitation, and solid waste. So we ask residents if they have enough access to water. What is the quality of the water? Sometimes we ask questions around the distance to taps. What is the access to sanitation? Does the municipality clean the toilets regularly, which are services that municipalities are responsible for? And so this monthly real-time community-generated data forms the basis of advocacy that communities are doing themselves. So they are meeting with city governments to ask for better services, to try and influence budgets in particular. Some of the work we do with our partners is around budget training. So residents have an understanding of how some of these decisions are made and can engage with government from an informed perspective. But the community-generated aspect and the community-driven aspect of this work is really fundamental to the approach. The campaign started in 2020. It's grown significantly. We cover over 350 informal settlements across South Africa, over 3,500 residents, and we see the impact of this locally driven budget advocacy very clearly. Last year alone, over 500,000 residents received better water and sanitation because of the collective efforts to advocate for these services. One of the biggest learnings for us very early on in this campaign is that women's voices matter the most. I will say that we didn't start out with this campaign being women-centered, but we collected gender disaggregated data, and we got lots of feedback from our partners about the level of engagement of women. And at this point, over 70% of our participants in Asifikelane are female. They're the ones who are monitoring services. They're often the ones who are leading these advocacy engagements with government. And Rosa touched on this in her presentation. One of the big reasons for that is that they are most impacted by the quality and safety of these services. They're often the most frequent users. They're the ones who are standing in long queues, collecting water, carrying that water back home and using that for cleaning and cooking, for example. And safety is a major concern in that context. So we believe that women are best placed to define some of these problems and advise on these solutions. And we think that one way of doing that is to use the procurement process to enable services which are safer and more accessible for women. Now, one of the strongest messages that we've gotten from women who are part of the campaign and who are living in informal settlements is that sanitation really is an issue of safety, and women face the biggest risk in this context. We did, in November last year, we did a focused round of data collection and community engagement on sanitation across informal settlements. And about 3/4 of women told us they feel unsafe using communal toilets at night. And about 1/4 of them said they feel unsafe doing so during the day. There are a number of reasons why they feel unsafe. And a lot of those reasons do relate to the infrastructure itself. So these planning and policy decisions about the provision of toilets, which is a municipal function, has a direct impact on women's well-being. And I've got a list there of some of the issues that residents have raised as their primary concerns. So the location of the toilets is a big factor. And I'll just draw your attention to the picture in the top right there. You'll see that those are about 10 or 12 communal toilets which are installed in sort of clusters, and they're installed on the periphery of this informal settlement. This is an informal settlement in Cape Town. And you can just imagine that if you load a few meters, let alone a few hundred meters from that toilet, it's the thought of having to go there at night is very scary. There's a serious lack of public lighting in many places, and it's a dangerous undertaking, which it shouldn't be, to do something as basic as using the toilet. And women have told us what their fears are. They fear being raped, they fear being robbed, and I don't think we can underscore just the impact that the way the provision of the services can have on women's safety. Some other issues raised are toilets without doors. There's a picture there of a toilet with a broken door, and at the bottom right corner as well, that's a chemical toilet where the door has come off completely. That's obviously a complete violation of dignity and privacy and human rights. That's not a usable toilet facility. At the bottom here, you can see an illegal dumping site right in front of the toilet, which is a huge, huge health risk. So these are some of the issues that women have raised, and which is informing some of our focus advocacy when it comes to sanitation and procurement. And you might be asking yourself, well, what is the link between procurement and sanitation and the story which I've just conveyed? Well, we estimate that about 50% or more than 50% of sanitation in informal settlements that municipalities provide are provided through a procurement process, so through supplier contracts. And we've spent quite a bit of time looking at these contracts across the metros. My colleagues who work in research have thoroughly scanned the documents across the different cities. And it's very clear that as far as women go and women's rights goes, the emphasis is on women suppliers. So we have this national target of 40%, I think it is, of contracts should ideally be granted to women. And we think that's great. We're very encouraged by that shift. But we are concerned that there is far less focus on women's experience as users of these services. And you can see from what I've shared and what Rosa discussed, that this is absolutely critical. One example is that having scanned several tender documents for toilets in the metros, not a single one of these tenders required the service provider to ensure that the toilet had a light on the inside. And women have told us that because of this, they use their cell phone for lighting, and this just makes them even more of a target for crime. Criminals target the clusters of toilets because they know people have to use it, and it puts women in an extremely vulnerable position. So again, a direct link between infrastructure procurement and safety. And so despite the fact that these specifications do have a big impact on women's safety and health, in South Africa at this point, the procurement processes do remain gender blind and rather exclusionary. In a round of a consultation with residents across hundreds of settlements, about 90% of them told us the government has never consulted them about sanitation. And that's something we really, working with our partners, want to do something about. Through Asivikalani, we do engage residents, so we do ask them about their experiences, but also their solutions. And November last year, we did a focus around on what residents want around sanitation, what does safe sanitation look like for them? And they've offered some very practical examples of what can be done. Public lighting was a high priority across informal settlements. Almost 90% of residents said they want and need toilets that are located closer to where they live. They would prefer to have to walk less than 10 minutes to reach the toilet. Almost 2/3 of residents said that they would prefer separate toilets for men and women in particular felt that this would make it safer for them. There was a request for more frequent cleaning of toilets, which has a big health impact. And above all else, residents want to engage government. And, while I've spent a bit of time identifying some of the gaps and critiquing these procurement processes, I think it's really important to share some examples of where community input and engagement in tender processes has happened and has had an impact. And these are examples from South Africa, work that IBP South Africa and its partners had done in Gauteng. Over several years, we've worked with 2 Gauteng municipalities, Trana and Ekurhuleni, specifically focusing on the tender specifications for taps and toilets. There was an extensive round of community engagement, largely through social audits, but also through our own remote data collection. And some of the issues residents highlighted and brought to the surface or to the forefront has been around maintenance, which was not something that was high on the municipality's agenda. But residents started drawing their attention to toilet doors that are broken or damaged, toilets themselves that are not functional. And so these inputs were become incredibly valuable in informing the tender specifications. And across these 2 metros, they actually adapted the specifications. And as a result, 304 informal settlements will now have toilets that are cleaned more regularly, have locks on doors, and are disabled friendly. So the big learning for us around this experience and this example has been that identifying these specific system problems from the bottom up, from the ground up, is really important, and it's an important entry point. And from there, you can mobilize change. And this is a really encouraging case for us as we look to expand this work into other metros and even other spheres of government who are involved or play a role in procuring basic services. So in conclusion, I think our overarching message is that procurement is a tool to improve safety for women. Infrastructure procurement can either protect women or increase their risk to harm. We obviously wanted to do the former, but it is important to recognize that if it's not done equitably and inclusively and with women in mind, it will do them harm. There's an extensive body of research globally to show that communities, even cities designed for women, are better for everyone. And we think that's very much the case in informal settlements as well. And the procurement policy and processes can be inclusive and responsive to women's needs. We don't think this is an impossible task. Yes, there are policy implications, there are budgetary implications, but partnerships with communities and grassroots organizations, for example, are really key to unlocking the potential for improving these processes. And some of the practical things that municipalities can start to do is really around access. So make the tender specifications easy to access. We did some research with the Dula Omar Institute a year or so ago where they scanned several websites looking for tender specifications. Some municipalities have no page at all on their website for tender specifications. In other cases, you'd have to pay to see it. And by the time you do acquire it, usually the project is, those specifications have already been determined, so there's not much of an opportunity to influence it. So we encourage and call on municipalities and other spheres of government to be thoughtful and intentional about making these documents accessible. And then as far as the technical specifications themselves go, they do tend to be technical, engineering focus, structural, etc. And those things are important. And some of them do have a bearing on safety. But we again think that there's an opportunity to go beyond that and start considering issues of safety, privacy, space and location, the space around the toilets, health and hygiene, as well as disability and access. So this is an emerging area of research and advocacy for us. We are excited about the potential and these types of partnerships that we starting to forge with academia, with government and the Auditor General, we've been speaking to as well for several years around this. I think it's really important in enabling us to move this forward and influence not only policy, but actual implementation on the ground. The example from Shana and Ekurhuleni, I think, is really important for other metros because it's a demonstration of what's possible and, you know, an opportunity for them to learn from each other and implement similar measures. I have to give a nod to our partners that we work with and Asivikelani. They really are the ones driving change in communities and have been, you know, already part of some of our initiatives around women and procurement and will continue to support this work. Yeah, if you'd like to learn more, those are our details. And thank you so much for attending today. I'm happy to take questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you so much for that presentation, which painted the picture of the South African landscape when it comes to women and public procurement. I will ask that we move on to Dr. Alison Anthony's presentation, and then thereafter we'll take a combined session of Q&A. So Dr. Anthony, the floor is yours. Wonderful.
Thanks, Angela. I just wanted to share my slides. Can you confirm that you can see them?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, great. Thanks.
Yes.
Thanks everyone for joining and the previous speakers for very, very informative presentations. I'll now carry on to how women's rights can be advanced through infrastructure procurement law specifically. In other words, I asked myself the question, we know that we have these women's rights issues, but how can we fix them through procurement? Firstly, is procurement the answer to this issue? And if it is or can be, how can we fix it? My specialty is infrastructure procurement law, and over the world, or the world over rather, procurement in general has been used for gender responsive contracting. But I think that there is a huge gap in that we're not paying attention to the significant role that infrastructure procurement specifically can play in this instance. So why is this necessary? Rosa alluded to many of these issues, but just to go over them specifically, there are issues of poverty, unemployment, and economic empowerment. So there are specific issues related to infrastructure that women face. For example, poverty, unemployment, and economic empowerment. Women are actually 25% more likely to be in extreme poverty, according to the OECD. And poverty, as we know, exacerbates gender inequality and negatively affects empowerment. Rosa earlier alluded to the fact that unequal income generation still exists today in the gender gap and the empowerment opportunities that are more available to men vis-a-vis women. Lower decision-making power in households and in workplaces also leads to inequality between men and women. Rosa also alluded to rural and migrant women being more vulnerable. There's inequitable access to basic services and resources. And COVID-19 has obviously had a large impact on the economic and other empowerment of women as well. If we think of the health services, which have largely women that are nurses, services such as catering, hotels, we have mostly women in those sectors, and those are the sectors that were naturally most affected during COVID-19. And in general, the unemployment rate is generally higher for women than it is for men. Tracy spoke about the safety and the well-being challenges. The mortality rate for women due to unsafe water, sanitation, and hygiene. Those concerns are actually much higher for women than it is for men. And there is a lack of women-centered needs. For example, in the case of pregnancy and birth services, menstrual hygiene, everything that is woman-specific. Rural women are also exposed to higher levels of air pollution. If we think of the distances that they have to walk to fetch water, when they are exposed to air pollution due to the burning of coal and wood for the purpose of cooking or heating. There are also higher levels of GBVH. Now, the OECD, and I think this is to be commended. In South Africa, we only refer to it as gender-based violence, but the OECD refers to it as gender-based violence and harassment, which I think is a much more accurate way of putting it. So for purposes of this presentation, I'll be referring to it as GBVH. Then, of course, our political empowerment challenges, where we know that women are underrepresented in decision-making. Now, why infrastructure? Why should we use infrastructure to correct these challenges? Well, infrastructure can play a large role. As I've said, we have access to better and safer sanitation, or infrastructure development of infrastructure can provide better access to safer and better sanitation, the greater availability of transport. For example, if you need to use public transport, which most South Africans do in order to get to work, if we upscale those and create safer public transport spots, the spots where you catch your bus or the train, well-lit bathrooms and public transport areas. And an important one is also access to information technology. That both the OECD and the UN have found that women have less access to information technology. And in order to have job opportunities or any kind of access to the workplace, there is some kind of accessibility, some kind of technical ability that's needed in information technology to break those boundaries or to have access to the workplace. Now, using procurement as a tool for advancing women's rights, I believe is a very good opportunity, because a country has, or procurement rather, forms more or less 22% of a country's GDP. Now, it differs from developing countries and developed countries, but this is just an approximate percentage. Both Rosa and Tracy also mentioned that most infrastructure in South Africa is procured through public or government procurement. And as we know, public procurement involves a high public spend, and therefore there's significant public interest. Now, how can we fix, or how can we use infrastructure procurement for the betterment or advancement of women's rights? Stakeholder engagement that Tracy referred to, engaging end users of the product. I'm speaking in very general terms, but from the next slide, I'll be looking at long-term achievable solutions in the infrastructure procurement process and immediate ones that we can start implementing right away. But generally, how can we do this? Firstly is stakeholder engagement, involving women in the public procurement process, which will entail involving them in the needs process, identifying where there's a need, involving them in your drafting of the specifications, as Tracy said, involving them in the entire public procurement process in terms of your pre-tender stage, the tendering stage, the award stage, and monitoring afterwards that the process was indeed gender responsive, and over time, of course, that there has indeed been a difference made by making the process more gender responsive. Including more women in decision making is, of course, another option, and increasing the number of women in procurement and infrastructure in the infrastructure space. Currently in South Africa, only 30% of construction workers are women. I don't think that's too low an amount for what is happening globally, but of course, for the gender differences between men and women, 30% is rather low. In South Africa, or in the construction industry at least, 25% of contracts are awarded to women-owned businesses. So the construction industry, I believe, is actually a good pilot industry for rolling out gender-responsive procurement, because they have much of the basis for what's needed to start the process. For example, they are already doing data capturing. They already know numbers such as these, that 25% of contracts are awarded to women-owned businesses, that currently only 30% of construction workers are women. They also have specific programs that are aimed at the development of women. All right, my time is running out, so let's go to the solutions. All right, so first let's look at the long-term achievable solutions. As Geo said earlier, at the moment, we are going through a process where the South African public procurement system is undergoing an entire overhaul, a complete reform, and it's actually the time now for us to include gender responsive, what's the word I'm looking for? Gender responsive clauses, gender responsive laws and provisions in the public procurement bill. Currently, only 29% of OECD countries have long-term gender-responsive infrastructure plans. This is throughout the entire world. So some of the ideas of the long term are that there could be grounds for exclusion. So there could be grounds for excluding tenders or contractors for the lack of women in their contractor businesses. In other words, where businesses are mainly mainly consist of men in their businesses. There could also be grounds for exclusion for lack of equal pay implementation. In Europe, and specifically in Iceland, there is legislation which requires that all companies and all contractors need to provide documentary proof that they have equal pay in their businesses. And this is definitely something that we could implement in South Africa. And this is something that is regulated or managed centrally. So that would be like in the case of South Africa, we have the OCPO, the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer, or another body that would be established in terms of the public procurement bill that would be in charge of that. Qualification incentives for empowerment of women in contractor businesses. Okay, so what do I mean by that? When we qualify contractors for tenders, the fact that they are either empowering women or have a certain number or percentage of women employees sorry, I'm interrupting myself, but I'm getting notification here, Angelo, that Teams is only giving us another 5 minutes or another 15 minutes. So I don't want us to be disconnected in that time. If we can just extend the time on Teams, please, while I continue. All right, qualification incentive for empowerment. So when contractors are submitting their tenders to be qualified for the tender process, the fact that they have women in their contracting business or that they are training women is a criteria that can be used for qualification, in my opinion, and it is being done in other countries, for example, in the EU and Latin America. For example, there could also be a qualification incentive for women-owned or women-led subcontractors. So there could be extra points awarded as well for the fact that these contractors are subcontracting with women-owned or women-led subcontractors. We know that in South Africa, the PPPFA requires that 51% such points or such preference, if I could call it that, can be awarded where the business is 51% owned. But in Latin America, they're also referring to not just women-owned businesses, but also women-led businesses and subcontractors, which I think is an area that would be worth breaking into. Then some countries are also providing documentary proof of gender-based needs assessment. So that would mean that when a contractor submits a tender or a bid offer, they would need to show documentary proof that they have done gender responsive procurement. In other words, that they have looked into the statistics of how many women are available out there? What is the market like? How have they made their procurement process gender responsive? And they would need to provide documentary proof of that. It could also be used in set-asides. Set-asides are not permitted in terms of the current preferential system, but as we are using or changing the procurement system, reforming the public procurement bill, I really think that this is something that should be seriously considered to be included in the new legislation. In Colombia, for example, set-asides are being used where a certain percentage of public expenditure is being awarded to women-owned businesses where those businesses are headed by single mom households. And they've seen an improvement of, I think, up to more than 30,000 households that have been empowered through a provision like that. Then I already mentioned the equal pay legislation, which is a requirement in Iceland. The Global Gender Gap Report has shown that South Africa is at the moment 68% in the process to closing the gender gap. Now, that may seem like a high percentage, but it actually isn't, because they found that it would take 98 years to close that gap completely. So we have 100 years to go if we keep going at the pace that we are at the moment. There is also a system which is freely available. It's currently being used in the EU, which is an electronic tool that's used to assess compliance with equal pay. So that means, how do we gauge what equal pay should be between men and women? And LOGIP, this system is one. It's freely available, so we could use it in South Africa as well. It's an electronic tool for contractors to go onto, where they enter the years of experience, the qualifications of the women, and a whole lot of other requirements as well, in order to assess whether they are on par with what the women in their companies should be paying. There can also be mandatory policies for GBVH in workplaces. For example, documentary proof that contractors have zero tolerance policies against gender-based violence and harassment. That is one way that we could empower women through the process as well. And something that will be incredibly important would be an improved data collection and reporting. So we would need to know how many women businesses are out there to begin with. What kind of work services and goods do they provide? How often do they take part in the public procurement process? What are the barriers to them entering the process? And one of these barriers has been stated, especially in Latin America, but that we found also in our research last year, Shope, you referred to that earlier, is that the tender documentation is not very accessible. So the tender documentation would need to be reviewed and be made simpler. People with PhDs look at tender requirements and have no idea what's going on. So it's very exclusive, and it's something that we need to look at in order to break down and make it more accessible. Even people in a specific industry who are experts in a specific industry struggle to figure out what these tender requirements are. So linked to that, things like workshops, for example, training that needs to be done so that everybody understands what these specifications are, what is expected of each and every contractor, and in order for everybody to submit responsive tender bids. And this is something that Latin America has focused on as well, and has shown great improvement in the involvement and the willingness of women-owned and women-led businesses in involving themselves in the public procurement process. Another long-term initiative would naturally be, we all know that we need to rebuild transport in South Africa, and that public transport needs to be a lot more accessible. Studies have been done which show that women are more inclined to either not work or work half day because their workplace is too far to get to, or because there's a really long commute in order to get to their workplace. And this can be corrected through advancing or rebuilding the transport system in South Africa. Now, working half day or not working at all is, of course, what contributes to the lower economic empowerment of women as compared to men. We know that we need female policy and decision makers in our executive and in parliament as well. I think I've already spoken about this, where we can evaluate a contractor's contribution to gender equality, not only in the number of women that they employ or the type of empowerment that they have, but also in how they train and empower women outside of their business is an option as well. But of course, the focus would be how they empower women within their own contracting businesses. Another important initiative could be gender-sensitive recruitment policies, that contractors and businesses show that they have gender-sensitive recruitment policies and how they've improved over time, of course, from when they started implementing gender-sensitive recruitment policies to the time that they actually submit a tender. Now, in the current legislative framework in South Africa, we use the PPPFA. It's called the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, and also the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Scorecard. Now, for those not from South Africa, the BBBE scorecard is a scorecard that each contractor needs to comply with. And there are 7 specific elements, and those elements relate to training, to management, to empowerment initiatives that businesses or contractors engage in. And they then receive a score in terms of how, based on their performance in those 7 elements, and that score is then converted to a score out of either 10 or 20, so that they can be awarded a specific number of points in terms of the PPPFA Act and the regulations. Now, the PPPFA has a point system. We just refer to it as the point system. It's a 90-10 or 80-20 point system, where 90 points are awarded for price and 10 for preference, or then 80 for price and 20 for preference, depending on the value of the contract. So where the scorecard fits in is under the 10 or 20 points. So a contractor would receive a score out of either 10 or 20 for their broad-based Black economic empowerment. And the reason why I'm explaining all of this is because that is perhaps under the current legal framework where we can include gender-responsive procurement to make it included either in one of the existing elements, which is very possible, or to make it an 8th element, which I think would be justified because it's such an important and such a drastic step that we need to take in order to not wait 100 years for gender equality. Extra points could be awarded for women-owned businesses. These are called compliance points in the DR, Dominican Republic. Also in Colombia, if I remember correctly. So contractors can be awarded extra points for contracting with or for being women-owned businesses, or subcontracting with women-owned or women-led businesses. It's also a way to track compliance over time. So it's another, I think in South Africa, it might be a little tricky because we have so much compliance, so many compliance obligations already, but it is being used in Latin America, where contractor businesses have a certificate and a score as well, a compliance points that they are given to show to what extent they've complied with certain requirements, and one of those is gender responsive procurement. That is perhaps something that we can think of in the new public procurement bill. It could also be used as a criteria for a tiebreaker between 2 contractors. At the moment in the PPPFA, the tiebreaker is preferencing. So if you have a contract, 2 contractors who have the same number of points, they both received 90 points or both received 80 points, and you cannot decide who the winner should be. The level of gender responsive procurement that they engage in could then be used as a tiebreaker. Now, these are all, of course, long-term solutions that we can use. Those that can be immediately achievable are involving women stakeholders in the process, the tender process, as I've said, consulting them on the needs in the end product or service. That would be a pre-tender stage gender responsive procurement practice, engaging women in the creation of the specifications of a product, then also monitoring gender responsive and inclusive procurement. Data tracking is something that we could start doing now already. Municipalities could advertise that women, or investigate or use their data systems to determine how many women businesses are in their municipal areas. What kind of sources, what kind of market are they involved in? What kind of goods, services, and works do they provide? How often do they contract with the government? And if they don't, why not, in order to overcome those barriers? Accessible tender documentation, as I stated earlier, and holding workshops and social inclusion meetings to ensure that everybody's on the same page with what is being procured so that we can have more responsive bids. Then we can also already start having improved data collection of women-owned businesses, their products, the work, services, and include them on procurement databases. Often what I found when I engage with municipalities is that they don't know who the women-owned businesses are, whether they have any, how many they have, and what services they provide. So that is something that could be dealt with at municipal level. It can already be included in SEM policies now. Now, many municipalities stated last year that the reason that they don't have gender responsive procurement or take any kind of women's rights into consideration is because there's no legal mandate for it. There's no legal rule or National Treasury instruction note instructing them to do this. But we have a little bit of a gap now. While organs of state and procuring agents are allowed to set up their own SEM policies, this is not against any procurement rules at the moment. So it could be something that's included in the policies moving forward. Something that will be really imperative in getting this off the ground would be training for officials on gender sensitivities. Why? Explaining to people, why is this even necessary? Because we need to have buy-in from everyone in order to make this happen. Training for officials on gender sensitivities and how and why we are implementing gender responsive procurement measures. I think, yeah, we're starting to run out of time. This is not an exhaustive list, not under the immediate achievable solutions or the long-term achievable solutions. Tracy and myself have partnered on writing a paper on this topic. So we are finishing that paper soon. I'm not sure when it will be available realistically, probably next year based on the publishing process that takes a little bit of time. But these are just some of the issues that we are, and some of the suggestions that we make in the paper that can be used immediately and over time. Essentially, what we would like to see is that gender infiltrates throughout the entire country and that there is policy alignment and legislation and legal framework alignment throughout South Africa, as is being done in other countries. In Europe, they have the Institute for Gender Equality, and everything based on gender, it goes through the institute. So essentially all legislation would need to be looked at through a gender lens. And this is not, doing women a favor or saying, okay, we need to avoid the 100 years of closing the gender gap. But it's also based on our Constitution in Section 9, which says that everybody has the right to be treated equally. Actually, Section 9.2 says that equality includes the full and equitable enjoyment of all rights and freedoms. to promote the achievement of equality, legislative and other measures designed to protect or advance persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination may be taken. So Section 9(2) of our Constitution mandates us and gives us the permission to include in our laws and to structure in our laws measures that advance women. And I think that infrastructure procurement is a really good way that we can do this and achieve quite a lot of advancement. Thanks, everyone. I think that that ends my presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Alison, for the presentation. Indeed, we are now moving on to the question and answer session. I already see some hands. Let me just queue up the system here so I can see the order in which those hands were raised. Bullion Joel, I see your hand. I will note you, you're number 1. I'm looking for a second hand. And these are questions directed at both the first and the second speaker. So there's one hand right now. I would like to take a round of hands before I allow the speakers to speak. Lizelle, I note your hand. You'll be number 2. Is there a third hand? Shall we have a third hand so that we can go with 3 questions? Okay, okay, there's a third hand. Adish, I note you're number 3 in that order. Adish, your hand was up and then it disappeared. Feel free to bring your hand up again, Adish. I hope if your hand was up, I'll recognize you as number 3. But otherwise, I'll go with Bullion Joel at number 1, Lizelle at number 2, and Adish at number 3, in that order. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And this is Joel Mbuli from Tswana Leadership Foundation in Pretoria. My first question is with regards to gender sensitivity. Are we, because I never heard any single mention of LGBTIQ. There was nothing of that sort mentioned here. Is this community not part of the gender you're talking about? And when you talk about women, I feel like it's just a blanket statement. Did you go deeper to say racially, Black women, white, colored, and Indian women? When you talk about women in business, say, and who are discriminated, what are the percentages? And with regards to 100 years, who in this 100 years between these races is closer or far away? And with regards to these tenders, I don't know, because in our country, we all know, maybe in somewhere else, we have good policies on paper, even our constitution, which is a non-negotiable. And the speaker has just referred to Section 9, that everyone must be treated equally and enjoy this equality. But now when it comes to practical, those things are really not happening. For instance, with your BEE or triple BEE, there is a lot of fronting, even from people who are qualified as Black businesses, but they can also front women. Are they able to discover that? Are the systems put in place able to really identify whether this is a fronting or not? And maybe lastly, the CSD in the local municipalities, because they do have a database, people are registering their companies there for tenders. Are they able also to categorize those database, whether these are women, these are men, LGBTQI or not? So that will be where I will end. Thanks.
So Lizelle, I noted you as number 2, followed by Adish at number 3, in that order.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm just checking, am I audible?
Yeah.
You are audible.
Wonderful. No, because I've joined via my phone. Okay, thanks. I would just like to ask Alison, and I apologize if I missed the point, but I found that one point on the slide very interesting, which said that there should be a set aside for single mother households. So I was just curious as to how that works in Canada and what exactly it is that is done and how that serves to benefit a single mother household. So that was just a question of curiosity, and I apologize if I missed what you said or didn't understand, but I was just interested in that and whether you think something like that could work in South Africa. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Jen. Thanks to all the presenters. Very interesting topic. So I'm Adish from UCT. Quick question I've got, I think, possibly to Alison or to any of the speakers, particularly in South Africa, but we're seeing this global pandemic of patriarchy that's really being pushed, and there's a history of patriarchy, and particularly if you look at the construction environment. It's actually, and I think the first question, I think it was Bule, asked the question of, we've got really strong policies, but in real action, it doesn't happen, and we're seeing this globally now. So how do we actually go about changing mindsets before we actually, get into policy and start digging into policy? Because we find a lot of policy is there, but it's not enacted. It's not enforced. Yeah, thank you.
Right.
I think the 3 speakers have all spoken. You guys can go ahead and respond.
Yeah. Tracy, I'll let you deal with the very first one regarding the LGBTQ because we have had this conversation. So you can go ahead.
Thanks, Alison. I think Billy and Joel, thanks for the questions, guys. You asked a couple of questions. I mean, just with regards to the focus of our campaign, when we say, Alison, you're frozen for a second. Okay. When we say women-led and women-centered, that really speaks to the participants who are engaged in Asivikelane. We spend a lot of time thinking about where our focus will be and what makes sense. And you're 100% correct, like the gender equality and the term gender is far more inclusive than women. LGBTQI rights are really important. We know that gender identities are important. And there are risks and vulnerabilities that the people in our community face as well. And those things will surface through the engagements that we do. Our work in particular, we've decided to frame our focus around women, acknowledging that the majority of our participants are women, and as I shared, the impact of the services on them is huge. Not only safety, health, well-being, the psychological impact, and yes, the lack of services affects everybody who lives in informal settlements. Right? We do know there are particular vulnerabilities that women face, and so that's the focus of our campaign. It's not to say that we don't think those other considerations or issues are important. They absolutely are. We are trying to establish partnerships with organizations who do work more in a more focused way around issues of gender, just to enable us to strengthen our advocacy around this as well. And then you raised the issue, and I think Adesh also raised the issue of policies that are not implemented, and you 100% spot on in identifying the key issues. That's really what drives the work that Asivikelane does with grassroots organizations and communities, is to look at issues of budgets and implementation. We know that where the money goes has a big impact on what does get delivered. And so we believe that this ground up approach will have an impact on implementation and delivery of those services, and also the policies that need to be amended or policy gaps that need to be addressed. So this is a massive challenge for South Africa, but it's also a massive opportunity. And we're hoping that with these initiatives, and we know there are many others working to address this from other angles, we do start seeing a change. I mean, this issue of capacitating officials came up in Alison and Rosa's presentation, and we believe that by our regular engagement with municipalities and communities, speaking to officials directly, their capacity is being built because they're learning about why women's rights are important. They're learning about our infrastructure has a bearing on health and safety. And again, that just brings to the fore why stakeholder engagement and participation, meaningful participation, is important and powerful. And through that, we think we are also changing mindsets. So we've had officials in some of the metros tell us that before, they engage with Asivikilani, with communities themselves, they didn't realize the implications of their budgetary decisions on not only access to services, but some of these vulnerabilities that women face. And so I think that just highlights for us why this continuous and extensive engagement is important as one measure to start to change those mindsets. Thanks.
All right. Let me start with the first, I think, Bully and Joel, the issues of fronting. Of course, in the way we frame and the way that we deal with, for example, my suggestion of requirements, such as proof of equal pay, proof of how many women work in a business, we would obviously need to really sit and think of how those things can be vetted. Fronting is a reality. I don't think we'll be able to get away from, corruption completely and entirely in the foreseeable future, but we will need to use, that's where things like artificial intelligence, blockchain, data collection, improving information technology will come into play in order to vet the correctness. That would be preventative measures. South Africa, in my opinion, likes punitive, what is the word I'm looking for? Punitive measures. Solving issues after the fact. I think we need to start focusing on preventative measures a little more, but punitive measures have a role as well. And those could be, at the moment, fronting is criminalized. So that would be one solution as well. Debarment from the public procurement process if it's found that you have lied on any of your documentation. And we already have these rules, actually. It's a matter of implementation. It's not being actively used. It's not being actively implemented. So we need to look at implementation issues. And together with reforming public procurement to be more gender responsive, we need an entire overhaul of the public procurement system. We need to rebuild our capacity. We need to get the right people with the right training in the right positions. And that will already make a difference in terms of ensuring that we have capable contractors, that we have trustworthy contractors, we have contractors with integrity, and decrease the corruption in the procurement process as well. So we, like you say, like Adish mentioned as well, we have wonderful policies where it's a matter of implementation. And so, of course, there would be preventative measures, those punitive measures that we can take, criminalization and debarment from the public procurement process. We have the Public Audit Act, which is also very, very, very strict on making mistakes. And mistake, I mean, in the legal sense, making legal mistakes and the consequences that come from that. In terms of changing mindsets, that would be, and this is applicable to the first speaker's question as well. Excuse me, it's a matter of training and workshops. It's a matter of sensitizing. And what I've learned in my time doing this is that it's often a culture that is created from the top to the bottom. So if we change our workplace cultures, it's also something that will go a long way in preventing unethical behavior when it comes to public procurement, because we have the laws. South Africa has good laws. We have good policies. It's a matter of implementation and a lack of consequence management. that we're grappling with at the moment. I didn't quite get the CSD question that you asked, Bully and Joel. If you can just clarify that in the chat, then I can get back to that. But the CSD is the Center Supplier Database, is a database by National Treasury in which they have a list of tenders or contractors that are available, but it's not gender responsive. So there's a lot of businesses, male-owned businesses. There have been studies shown that women don't want to contract with government for many reasons, for the complexity of the process, for the sexual harassment that they experience in the process, for the bribery. A lot of people just say there's just too much red tape in working with the government. We just don't want to. So they just operate in the private sphere, and those are the challenges that we want to overcome. So I don't think the CSD is, from a gender perspective, the most reliable database because it's not gendered, to my knowledge. Then with regard to Liesel, your question, the single-headed household, yes, I found that very interesting as well. It's actually not in Canada, it's in Colombia. You would be surprised that often we think that because we're a developing economy, there are very small things only that we can do, and it's not true, because in Latin America, they've really, really transformed their procurement systems. And they're all developing countries as well. So we have a lot to learn from Latin America. They've been extremely successful in their gender responsive procurement initiatives. So what they do is that they have 10%, they have a budget in the public budget, the procurement budget, and 10% of that is awarded to women-owned businesses where they are, where the women are single mom headed households. Of course, they have documentary evidence of that, and they have the infrastructure in place. And by infrastructure, I mean they have a body that manages, oh, we're out of time. Gosh, let me speak faster. So they have a regulatory body that regulates whether the information is correct or not. And they have implemented this, I think, the last 10 or 15 years, and it's shown to be extremely successful. It's something that I would like to think that we can implement in South Africa. The problem is just that single-headed households, we need to get the economic empowerment right in South Africa and our education levels. The UN has shown that we are way below the rest of the world when it comes to educated women. We are at 85% at the moment, and the global average is 92% education for women in specific countries. So we obviously need to do training. We need to have workshops and more opportunities so that women can feel empowered to come forward and say, I want to be an entrepreneur. You don't need formal education really to be able to come up with an idea and say, I'm an entrepreneur, make the financing available, which is a whole different set where I think the Department of Trade and Industry can play a large role. But that is a solution that we can look at as well. I think there's definitely lots of room for that in South Africa. That's why I mentioned it. Thanks.
Thanks, colleagues. I will take one last round of questions. I not you, Msekwa. I'm looking for the second hand. Okay, Adish, I think your hand is still up, but I would like to give the opportunity to someone who hasn't posed a question. Is there another hand, another person interested in posing a question to our speakers before we move on? Okay, going once, going twice. Okay, Musekwa, you're the last person to pose a question. Osandisa and Julian. Okay, after Musekwa, it should be Julian. After Julian, it should be Sandisa, in that order. Thank you very much.
You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. It's my mistake. Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much to our presenters for such a wonderful presentation. There was a question that was asked, but however, it was not responded to. I did not.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a question that was not responded to. This question concerned primarily the critical racial theory behind these particular researches that have been done, because the reality of the matter is that especially the presentation by Ms. Tracy Juste, I was carefully and closely observing each and every picture in your presentation, and each and every picture showed a black woman in particular. But in all these presentations that have been made, you have never problematized the issue of the critical racial theory, and it is questionable, because we can't take this in a blanket approach to say that we because for us to get to this conversation, there is somewhere where this problem originated, and well, for us to come to the issue of speaking about public procurement for women, we must also understand that you are emphasizing issues of policies and all those things, but there's an issue of the injustices of the past, and it's there in the preamble, but you are not you're not problematizing the issue of the critical racial theory, because we are creating a lot of struggles now. Honestly speaking, we've got the issue of the oppression of women, which is something that it has its own historical background, but it is not being problematized. The historical background is not being problematized. The injustices of the past have not been fixed even up to now. But here we are trying to praise the policies. How are we going to be able to implement the policies if we are failing to implement a very, 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 very simple text, which is the foundation of the Constitution, that we must heal the injustice of the past? Because the reality of the matter, looking at your presentations, the fact remains that in the South African context, it is black women who are still far more behind. And why do I bring this issue of the critical racial theory? I bring this issue of the critical racial theory because of the fact that if you let's say you're establishing a company, right, and you're applying for a tender, you must have tendered somewhere else before you go into tendering. They call them with grades. I just don't have a company, hence I wouldn't know much about it. They call them with grades that you have tendered here, you have tendered here, you have tendered here. And you must remember that for you to tender, you must have had equipment. And for you to get those equipments, if you are opening a company, let's say for an example, you go for something like a loan, and you must check, why am I emphasizing this issue of a critical racial theory? I'm emphasizing this issue of a critical racial theory because even if when you go to a bank, they still apply race. Are you black? Are you colored? Are you African? So you can see that there are dynamics and elements that come into play. But well, there are pictures of black communities, but you are not saying outright that which women are still left behind. We're not saying let's be racist or let's exclude other women, but we must also put that into context to say we've got problems and we must be able to say them outright with a 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much. So if you can just at least try to educate us, and also don't educate us limitedly. You must also give us the critical racial theory so that we're able to understand the background of where we're coming from and where we're going. Thank you very much.
The other hands that I recognized earlier, you may go in and go ahead and pose your questions in that order.
Okay, I think it's me, Julian Rumbelow. I'm calling in from the Western Cape. I work in our development planning, data and research unit. It's really just a comment rather than a question or a contribution to the conversation. And it's around this point of corruption in infrastructure procurement. I heard a statistic recently from a place called GIACC, G-I-A-C-C. I've put some information on that in the chat. It's a global center for anti-corruption in infrastructure procurement, which it's a very specific area. You need technical people with good knowledge of infrastructure to work on anti-corruption. You need checks and balances, etc. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because of the point made by Dr. Anthony earlier, which was around, we tend to be very reactive in South Africa. Once the horse is bolted, we want to chase after, the corrupt individuals or the people who've done something wrong. And what we really need to be doing is building a culture of anti-corruption in South Africa, as well as gender-sensitive budgeting and gender-sensitive procurement. And my sense is that, if we're trying to promote whistleblowers as opposed to putting in really good project checks and balances methods as promoted by GIAC through a multinational and very African and developing world network, we're placing an unreal burden or an unrealistic burden on society as a whole, and particularly on women, because being a whistleblower is difficult. People get into a lot of sort of physical danger because of that route. And while it's necessary, I would say that what we really need to be doing is ensuring that contracts have the necessary project anti-corruption systems. I mean, a lot of it is explained through that website I've mentioned, so that procurement becomes very difficult to corrupt, and therefore far easier to get sort of equitable outcomes generally for everybody, and including women. So I just wanted to add that access to that resource, and thank you for a very informative and encouraging afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you, Julian, for that question. The next two hands will be Sandisa, followed by Brighton, and then we'll close it there.
Oh, thank you so much. I'll ask to be excused because I won't show my video. I'm at home and I'm a little bit ill today. My voice is a bit funny, but I just thought that it's important to come and join this as someone who's currently practicing in the SAM space, and also, my current role where I work is I'm also the gender focal point. And we're trying to create, a different experience in the institution where I work, where we want to view everything through a gender lens. So I felt it's important, to come here. I think some of the things that Julian just spoke to really now were some of the things that I also wanted to also, raise, because I think when Adish spoke, he emphasized the point of saying that there's a lot of legislation, but what happens is that, it's not implemented. It's really not implemented. What tools should be used really, to make sure that implementation happens? And if you look at SAM environments, they're corruption prone. The minute you say you want women, some entrepreneur out there is already thinking of a way, to circumvent the system so that they can benefit as well. So yes, I think this is important, but I was also interested to find out if Alison also, because she was mentioning a lot about municipality. I'm in the legislative sector. I work for Parliament. So I wanted to check if you're only limiting your research only to the municipalities. I find that as someone who works for Parliament, that people sometimes don't pay particular attention in terms of what goes on in Parliament. They only look at the House and they forget about the administrative side of Parliament, which is part of the administrative side. So I'm quite interested about that. And I didn't quite catch the concept of social witnesses. I'm interested to hear about that as well, if there's still time. Thank you so much. This is very informative.
Thank you, Sandy. So, Dr. Mpangavanu, you're next. That will be the last question, and then we'll take the responses and close it.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Well done, Dr. Alison Anthony, for putting together this wonderful seminar. I must commend you for your efforts, especially I'm looking at the people that you have invited. I mean, somebody from IBP South Africa to come and participate, and a dean from Washington American University. Am I saying it right? I think. Yes, George Washington University, to get high-profile people is like that to come and speak and contribute to discussions and jurisprudence on these matters is something wonderful. So well done on that. I thought I should just comment on that. And also, I just want to also, take notice of the fact that the Department of is the department, your Department of Public, its constitutional and international law at UNISA. I mean, I've observed movements. I've observed the seminars that you have had. You are really quite leading, and I think this is quite good for our higher education. And so thank you guys for what you're doing. And the question I'm going to ask you, you don't have to answer it now. You can think about it another time. I just, I am probably preempting what is to come in future, but I will be very interested in your views in future on the role of procurement, not just public procurement, but the role of procurement on issues such as, we have seen price fixing issues, the challenges that we have seen in some industries, and the impact that all that has on the consumer, and so I am just saying maybe for the future, I would really want to hear what your view is. Maybe I am passionate about seeing a link between the great work that you're doing and the work in competition law and the work in consumer protection law. And I don't know if you have something to say now, or it's something that we must look forward to in the future.
Thanks, Brighton.
Yes,
Right,
you can respond, colleagues. I think
right,
Brighton is finished. Yes.
All right, so I'll go from Brighton. Thank you, Brighton, for that acknowledgement. The role of procurement and issues like consumer impact. Yes, it is something that we've been talking about for the longest time. We don't have any data that I'm aware of. Unfortunately, data improvement is a huge part of what we need to improve in South Africa. I think if we can get our data sorted out, I think that will go a long way in being able to engage in new initiatives, because then we have information like who, what, where, how, when. So currently, unfortunately, our data in public procurement is less than ideal, but it is definitely something that's why we're having these kinds of get together, so we can really inform people of the issues and let them know, while we are reforming the laws, what should be in there. And the data collection is incredibly important. But thank you very much for your comment. Julian as well, thank you for that comment. I completely agree with what you're saying. Thank you for the information on the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center. The study is not limited to municipalities at all. Sandisa, it's actually focusing on national legislation. I just mentioned municipalities because usually people say the other way around. They're usually saying you're focusing on national legislation, but where you really reach the people is at municipal level. So that comment was just for the benefit of people at local government level, because they are closest to the people than national government, because national government is, of course, it's a big job and the wheels of change move very slowly. The promulgation of legislation is quite a process. So I mentioned that as an idea for municipalities to start implementing immediately. That's why I made the distinction between initiatives or measures that we can take now immediately, so that we don't feel so overwhelmed that, these issues can't be sorted overnight. There are we really need a plan. We actually need a department like they have in Europe, that is the Center for or institution for gender equality, where we have an overhaul of the entire system to make South African law gender responsive in each and every sector or industry. So yeah, it really needs to infiltrate in all our laws and policies. Then the issue on social witnesses, I thought that was very interesting as well. It's actually being done in Mexico, where there are specific registered social witnesses, which are citizens that go and confirm to the government and everybody else that this procurement was done above board, which I think is novel. It's really nice. It's something else. It has room for corruption, especially in a country like South Africa. But we can work around it and we can work with it. Like Julian said, we can, prevention is better than cure. Start looking at preventative measures rather than reactive. And I think that is one preventative measure that Mexico has used in the gender responsive procurement, where they actually have citizens. It's like a jury system almost, where you have your citizens holding each other accountable. And I think that really has value rather than this up-down vertical relationship where the government is big brother. So I think it's a good idea to get these social witnesses. We of course need to find a way that it will work in a South African context, but I think it's a wonderful idea and it's something that we can definitely look at. Yeah. Then the issue of racial theory. We are not racial theorists, but that is not denying the fact that Black women, hands down, are way, way, way behind white women. Let's just say it the way it is. For the longest time, yes, our affirmative action and our preferencing policies have looked at women as a whole and has not acknowledged that Black women are disadvantaged at a different level. So we acknowledge that entirely, and it is acknowledged in the study. This is just the seminar. The paper will have a lot more detail about that. But we will not be focusing on racial theory as such, the academic racial theory, because I'm not a sociologist and I believe that you need to have the correct background in order to do that. But what is needed is a study, and that's perhaps where IBP can come in order to recognize, how many white women, how many Black women, how many colored women, how many Indian women. Maybe we can use the legal, I think we should keep away from the legal definition of Black, because that's just grouping people together again. And that's not how the damage was made in South Africa back in the day. But there's definitely, again, a lack of data on how that's done. So I think that's perhaps a role that IBP can play in determining the specific areas. Tracy, maybe you can speak to why you choose the specific areas that you choose to focus on, perhaps because they are Black women and they are the most disadvantaged. Because, you would rather go to a township in Cape Town, for example, rather than a middle-class area for obvious reasons. So I hope that answers your question a little bit more, simply because the racial theory is a specialty on its own, and I don't profess myself to be an expert in that at all, but the study does definitely recognize that the struggles of Black women are completely disproportionately different from not only men, but from white women as well. Tracy?
Yeah, thanks, Alison. I just want to appreciate the questions and comments. I think they're really useful and insightful, and it gets us thinking about different streams or aspects, those intersections that relate to this work, particularly the race issue. Rico is correct. Racial injustice is part of our past. It's also part of our present. The majority of residents living in informal settlements are Black. And that is a manifestation of the impact of apartheid, but also the impact of poorly implemented policies and corruption and other factors since our democracy. And Black women do bear the greatest cost of that. We work in informal settlements because the the urban poor are located in informal settlements in these very precarious conditions, which I mentioned. And we work in cities because that's where the majority of informal settlements are located. And there is a clear racial aspect to that. So I appreciate the reference to that and, just bringing that to the forefront again. That is an important consideration. And then to the other participants as well for your questions and inputs. It's really fantastic to have people in this seminar from a diversity of perspectives. I think that strengthens our thinking and framing, and we've learned a lot from your questions too. So thanks everyone, and thanks to Alison and UNISA for organizing this. And yeah, we look forward to building on the discussion today to take this work forward. Thanks.
Wonderful. Wonderful indeed. Interesting questions and interesting responses, but all in the in the spirit of trying to advance the state of women's rights in the context of public procurement. The next session basically sees me handing over to Dr. Lindelon Mhlongo to do the closing remarks and a word of and a vote of thanks, and a word of thanks. Dr. Mhlongo, who is our colleague at the Department of Public Constitutional International Law, also serves as as a founding member of the Afrikan Peer Growth Network. She will now take the floor and say a few words.
Thank you, Professor Dube, and good afternoon, colleagues. Please pardon me. I need to keep my camera off because my speakers on my laptop decided to stop working this morning. So please pardon that. Today's seminar came about as a result of a partnership between UNISA College of Law through the Public Constitutional and International Law Department, the George Washington University International Law and Comparative Law Studies, the International Budget Partnership, and the Asivikelane Initiative. Colleagues, I must say that we really had interesting presentations and interaction today surrounding one of the most important issues that affects the South African society. That is the advancement and protection of women's rights. This discussion is timely for two reasons. One, because there are gaps in the South African law and policies, and two, because the South African is about to, of course, wrap up the Women's Month for 2022. Colleagues, also allow me to thank and acknowledge our distinguished speakers, Ms. Nonhlanhla Mathibela, Dean Rosa in absentia because she had to leave immediately after her presentation to attend to other pressing responsibilities, and also Ms. Tracy Juster and Dr. Alison Anthony. We are really honored to have you here. Combining perspective from both practice and academia, you have given us so much to think about in order to improve women's rights in South Africa. And we really appreciate the efforts you are making, the efforts that you have made in making this collaboration a success. Personally, from the presentation that we had, I can safely say that we need to do away with the slogan, Watinta Abafazi, Watinta Imbogodo, which means you strike a woman, you strike a rock. I'm sure we can all agree that women are not rocks, but vulnerable human beings within our society, and we should actively protect their rights. And I am also told that we have distinguished government officials in our midst. It is really an honor to have them here. I must admit, colleagues, though, that at the beginning of this webinar, we had a glitch, and the organizing team would like to apologize for that, but fortunately, we managed to get back on track and still had a successful webinar. So please do allow me to thank the team, Prof. Angelo Dube, Mr. Sikelela Ndlazi, Mr. Tomi Mabala, Mr. Tendani Musekwa, and Dr. Alison Anthony. We really appreciate the work that you are doing in the college and the department. To everyone who has attended, thank you for making the time. Of course, it wouldn't be a webinar without your attendance. Last but not least, colleagues, I would like to thank our program director, Professor Angelo Dube, for steering the ship. We have now come to the end of our webinar. Thank you once again. Blessing, love, and light from the Global South. Thank you and goodbye, colleagues.
Thank you. Goodbye, colleagues. Thank you so much for coming through. Interesting.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, colleagues. Well done.